Responsibility. I'm Dane Rose, and in this exploration, we'll look at, I think, one of the more misunderstood. It's definitely among the most important words, but I also think it's quite misunderstood. And as I look at my own misunderstanding about responsibility, the core root, responsibility, the ability to respond, is not usually what we mean when we say who is responsible. Because what we're really asking when we say who is responsible, first of all, we're usually asking who's to blame, because we rarely ask who's responsible for something great. Like if someone wins the lottery, we don't say, who's responsible for that? And that tone, I think, is an important context for the word responsible. Meaning, I think that I, and perhaps others, learn that word in the context of a parent looking for who to punish. Who's responsible for this? That's the tone. That's my default tone when I think of the word responsibility. And so it's who's going to be punished for doing something wrong is, I guess, my physiological understanding of the word. But it's not actually what the word means. Because let's look at responsibility. Something happens, positive or negative. Let's say somebody wins the lottery. Let's say someone gets a promotion. Who is responsible? Well, everyone is capable of responding, and everyone does respond, meaning everyone who learns of a piece of information responds passively or actively in some way or another. If someone says, your daughter got a raise, and dad looks at the paper and says, that's a response. And of course, he has the ability to make that response. It's rather non-committal, rather passive, not terribly encouraging, but that is a response. Saying, oh, that's great news, that is a response. And anyone who responds is, of course, able to respond, which also means that everyone is response-able. Whether they say, I don't want to think about that right now, that is a response. I don't want to think about that. That's a response. It may not be the most effective response. The house is catching on fire. I don't want to think about that right now. Isn't an optimal response if you still want a house the next day, but it is a response. And so everyone is responsible. We're responsible for making ourselves irresponsible. For example, we read the news, and I can say, I don't want to read the news. We can say that for a variety of reasons. We can respond to the adrenaline narrative, right? This isn't news. This is just, a string of traumatic events in various parts of the world that's designed to stimulate my adrenaline so that I'm more likely to buy some product that piggybacks on that and the desire to calm down. So advertisers will spike adrenaline by doing some sex and blood. And then they'll try and sell something like soap or medicine or stress relief to say, basically, you're all revved up now because we've revved you up by taking all the sensational items in the entire world, compacted it into your little world via our media device. And now that we've got you all worked up about things that are not ever going to directly affect you, now let's try and sell you a relaxing bit of music, a bit of soap, a bit of therapy to calm down. So you could stop reading the news to respond to that. Like, I don't want to give advertising revenue and incentivize the adrenalization of media. You know, that's a response. I'm just not going to watch the news. But if we refuse to deal with our own neighborhood news, our own family, you know, our child says they're feeling really depressed, and we say, oh, that's nice, dear. Let's talk about that later. That's a response and a subsequent suicide, right? Well, I don't. Let's cover that up. We're not that kind of family. That's also a response. It may not be the response that changes an intergenerational abuse pattern, but it is a response. So who is responsible? Everyone. Everyone is able to respond. Now, perhaps a more useful question is not who is responsible, but a more useful question might be, what's the difference between discipline and punishment? What's the best way to attribute response? Like, who should respond to a given situation? But that's enough preamble. Let's look at the dictionary. So, responsibility. As a noun, responsibilities. 1, the state of being responsible for something or someone. And again, I think the dictionary is helping to bridge, well, I think it's muddying the root meaning of the word with cultural defaults. So, for example, in our culture, the parents are responsible for the child. And to some extent, a teacher might be responsible for the child in a class, and a policeman might be responsible for a child if they were picked up involved with some form of crime. That the culture has assigned roles. But we also see that those roles don't work terribly well. Meaning there's plenty of situations where the parents do not want to respond to what's going on in their children's lives, or don't have the ability, meaning they don't know how to, for example, manage a career and be a good parent. They may not know how to be a good parent. They may not know what a good parent is, and they may have no experience being a good parent. And so you might say, well, they lack the ability to respond competently because they don't have the training. And then you could say, well, whose responsibility is that? Well, we like to say that, well, it's the individual, right? It's the individual's job to first of all notice that there is no competent parental training at any point in the cultural cycle. Like our cult will raise you in whatever family you happen to be born in without any competent parental training. Your parents will not teach you how to be competent parents. That's step 1. Step 2, you'll go to school and you won't learn how to be a competent parent at school either. Then you go to college and you won't learn any competent parenting skills in college. You'll then statistically have 2.3 or 2.5 children, whatever it is, without any competent parental training. And you'll go to work and will not learn anything about competent parental training. And you will pass on the incompetence of your family system, of your cultural system, to your children without anyone intervening, other than to perhaps say you're a bad parent, which is statistically probable and self-evident, right? But they're not responding to that effectively either, which is why it doesn't change. Like when a whole neighborhood gets together and they gossip and they all agree that that's a bad parent. That is a response of blame, but it isn't a competent parental response either. If there was a competent neighborhood response to poor parenting, then it would resolve that way. But if the best that an entire neighborhood can do is get together and decide who's the rotten parent in the neighborhood and do nothing about it other than to give dirty looks to an ignorant and incompetent parent, well, that's why incompetent parenting will continue, right? Because dirty looks do not do anything to help people learn the art of parenting, right? And if shame and traumatic events lock cycles in place, for example, when you dissociate, one of the things that often happens is you repeat the pattern that you are dissociated around because some part of you doesn't understand what's going on because you're dissociated. When you have PTSD, you relive a pattern over and over, and sometimes you create the pattern again just to feel sane so that you're not having this enormous gap between what's going on in your mind and your body and what's going on in the outer world. You know, many veterans who have PTSD and have flashbacks and see bullets will re-enlist in the military because it's like, well, if I'm going to dream about that every night anyway, it might as well be real. And they actually feel better being in a live combat zone, reliving those pictures in the present than they do trying to get some sleep and trying to go to work and reliving the nightmares over and over again, right? So all of this is tied in with this statement, the state of being responsible for something or someone. So what this is saying is that within a given system, within a given culture, the culture assigns the task of responding to certain people. Right. So some cultures, this is where that statement, it takes a village to raise a child, comes from. Some people assign the responsibility, the task of responding to the entire community. This is our child, and we all have a role to play. Each generation has a role to play. The elders have a role to play, and it's a group effort. Together, we will raise adults. We will raise women, we will raise men, and we will play a community role in initiating those men and women. And those cultures have done a more effective job at creating the adult state of being than our culture that says it's the parent's job up to age 18, and then it's your job without any effective role models to become an adult, to become mature. After that, and we wonder why we have so many grown-up bodies running around like children, like teenagers, right? Well, we decided it was the parents' job whether or not they knew what they were doing. And then we decided that it was the individual's job whether or not they knew what they were doing. And then we decided as a culture not to institutionalize parental competency in any form whatsoever. We've institutionalized criticism and blame, and there'll be a variety of TV saying this is the wrong way to do it, this is the wrong way to do it. But we haven't actually mandated in homes or in school or in college or at work, we haven't mandated a course on how to be a good parent that is updated based on statistical output. Right? We haven't sampled 50 protocols of parenting in a scientific method, and then based on which of those methods brings about the most sustainable well-being for in the individual, the family, and the culture as a whole. And so that's going to be the default parental template going forward. We just haven't bothered to do that. And not having bothered to do that with the slogan, "It's not my problem," or "That's not my business," right? Those are protocols. Those are just words. if the culture agrees, and that becomes the default norm, then you have a lot of issues incompetently responded to, and you have the vast majority of people all agreeing that it's not their job to respond. Well, how's that working, right? So this is referencing that system that is within every culture, the state of being responsible. I would say that is the state of having a response assigned to a specific group of people for something or someone, right? So we assign the parents as being responsible for the child and everything that the child does up until the age of 18. 2, the opportunity or ability to act independently. The opportunity or ability to act independently. And of course, we all have that. We all have, most of us at least, have the ability to speak independently. We can conform, or we can speak outside of the framework of conformity. This isn't really, I mean, you could look at something like this. In my entire history on the planet, nobody has really sat me down and taught me what these words mean. I'm just supposed to kind of learn how everyone else uses them in a sentence. And so I've learned that responsibility, who's responsible, means that's what you ask someone when something went wrong and you're trying to blame them and get them to make it right, or at least exonerate everyone else, right? So that nobody else has to respond to anything. 3, a thing which you are required to do as part of a job or legal obligation. Okay, so those are all in the noun category. And so the legal in a culture of law is again saying that basically, even though everyone could have responded, nothing stopping anyone from responding, and there are many, many, many situations. For example, in our culture, you might walk by a house in the neighborhood that's getting ready to have a landslide. You walk by and you say, oh, that's not good. That land is going to slide. They're putting too much water on it. They didn't build the retaining wall properly. That land is going to slide. But the cultural response is, that's not my business, right? We don't, as a rule within our cult, knock on someone's door and say, I think your land is going to slide. Why? Because their response is, hey, in our cult, that's not your business. Don't disturb me. This is my house. I get to do what I want, blah, 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 blah. And so the response is usually, okay, I know that that's going to slide, but it's probably not going to slide when I'm walking by. So it's not my business. They say it's not my business. And when it slides, the police don't say, hey, all of you, how many of you knew that this was going to slide? Why didn't you respond? You didn't call in an engineer? You didn't build any wall? None of you responded. Now the public is going to have to spend $1 million of taxpayer money because none of you responded. Why? It would have taken $10,000 to solve that $1 million issue. Why is no one responding? Well, the answer is it wasn't legally designated. The legality in the cult is designating the response to this specific group of people, regardless, in many cases, of competence. So we assign responsibility to the person who owns the land rather than the person who has the most competence. Now that's our cult, right? Another cult could say it doesn't matter who owns the land. It's the job of the most knowledgeable geologist or civil engineer. Like whoever has the most competency in the community, your job is to speak up and see that this happens. And the person who owns the land will spend the money or do this and that to make it happen. But we want to be based on competence. And we're currently divided where legal responsibility has nothing to do with competence and everything to do with money. So if I have enough money to buy an elephant, I get an elephant, even if I know absolutely nothing about elephants. And so if the elephant dies, that's my fault. We don't ask about the cultural designation. But of course, that's equally, if not more, connected to why the elephant died, right? If somebody sells me an elephant without checking to see if I know what I'm doing, and everyone around participates in an elephant coming to my property without any awareness of what am I doing, do I know what I'm doing? And if the people who know about elephants do not feel, well, that's not my job because I didn't buy that elephant, and then the elephant dies, isn't that death more connected with the fact that we're linking legal responsibility to money rather than to competency? In other words, if you asked yourself the question, what would be the best way to ensure that these elephants live? The obvious answer would be that the people who know the most about elephants living are in charge of the elephants. Pretty straightforward, right? If you want a plane to fly, you don't put the person who bought the plane into the cockpit because they bought the plane. Instead, you ask, who are the people on the planet that know the most about flying this jet? And you put them responsible for the plane. And you put the people that know even more than them in charge of the school to teach pilots, right? So that works, right? But we do that with jets, right? We put the most competent people in the position of flying a jet, but we put the most incompetent people responsible for flying a child, for having a child and raising a child to be a constructive member of society. We give that to the least competent person in many cases, which is the parent who has not received any training, any scientific background about what works and what doesn't work. They've just received the example of their parents, which in every single case is a flawed example. And unfortunately, in a shame-based culture, where people feel ashamed when they admit a mistake, it's unusual for our parents to come to us and say, by the way, I did this, and this wrong. So when you have your child, don't do those things. The only reason I did those is because I'm an idiot, raised in an idiotic culture that didn't teach me how to have a good, be a good parent. That's why I did those things. I don't think they're a good idea. Having gone through the parenting process and watching how you shut down and watching the traumatic results and watching the point where you started acting out, I don't think what I did was a good idea. So when you come to have a child yourself, don't do any of these 200 things. Instead, I think I would have, doing it over again, do it this. In a shame-based culture, the parent is not going to offer that menu of mistakes and opportunities. And if they do, they're more likely to be blamed. And they're more likely to feel worse. If they say, hey, I'm doing something wrong here and here and here and here and here and here, and I'm sorry, and I wish I had done this, many, many parents, having been trained to be punished for mistakes and to feel shame, will feel worse rather than to say, wow, what a good job I did being a parent there, right? So this noun sense of responsibility is all about the culture's assignment of who's legally responsible according to everyone else. But it has nothing to do with actual ability to respond, and very little to do with what's the best response. So now as we go on to the adjective of responsibility, having a duty to do something or having control over or care for someone. That's, again, societally responded. We're not talking about raw ability to respond. 2, being the cause of something and so able to be blamed or credited for it. So that also does not have to do with the ability to respond. Response ability, other people have the ability to respond to our mistakes by blaming us or praising us. And other people also have the ability to respond to avoid various mistakes, right? So people can sit around saying, oh, that's not going to work out, but don't say anything. And then they can say, you're to blame. But those are not very effective responses. They're just culturally condoned responses. So everyone who participates in a protocol by causing it or allowing it is responding in a way that facilitates that protocol. Well, I didn't do that. No. But you also didn't change the cultural protocol. You didn't speak out about the protocol either. Well, yes, I did. I knocked on the door and I said, hey, this is a rotten protocol, and I was slapped in the face, and I said, well, okay, don't blame me if it goes wrong, and then it went wrong, right? Well, I've responded in those ways, and it's helped or it hasn't helped. Capable of being trusted or trusted, as in reliable. Someone is responsible. I think that comes the closest to the sense, not that someone is able to respond, but I would say that this meaning of the word is used to say they're responsible, i.e. they know what they're doing, i.e. their responses are responses that I can trust. Everyone responds. Some people respond by avoiding, like as soon as the supervisor isn't there, they stop doing good work. They're responding to the supervisor not being there by saying, okay, now we don't have to do what we said we would. We'll just be as lazy as possible. That's a response. It's an incompetent response. It's not a trustworthy response. So the word responsible is linking competent response. That this person tends to respond competently. And I think it's also very important, we tend to say that's a responsible person, but I think it's useful to say that that person is responding competently in this arena, as opposed to just that's a responsible person. Like if you put that person in charge of a nuclear power plant without any training, if they're responsible in that competent way, the best thing that they could say is, hey, you're not being responsible to put me, who doesn't know what I'm doing, in this role here. And if that's done, then there's a sense of response ability that's competent, meaning you can be relied on to tell, I don't know what I'm doing here, I do know what I'm doing there. That, again, is trustworthy. It's competent response. Of a job involving important duties or control over other people. So a responsible person might be considered, they're responsible for this whole group of people, And again, what they're referring to is, in this case, the use of the word is competent response. We're all capable of responding. We could all, any one of us could go into a group or a factory or whatever and say, hey, that's not good, do it this way, right? And we might be escorted out by incompetent people. If we knew what we were doing, we might, and they didn't know what they were doing, we might be escorted out under the basis that that's not your job, right? Which is one of the big crises in our cult today, is that there's always a distinct minority in any area that is the most competent in a given domain. And the majority is less competent, right? And so the problem comes when a majority, in a democracy, for example, the majority has the power, but the majority is never the most competent. And so the problem comes when an incompetent majority is having to choose the competent minority to handle something. And in these cases, the majority cannot tell who is and is not competent. So they'll often elect someone that makes them laugh or makes them feel good rather than someone who's competent in that area. And the person who they've elected doesn't have the competence to make the decision either, so they appoint someone that they like, one of their friends, or someone that makes them feel good, makes them laugh, makes their job easier, is willing to lie to the press to cover things up. And then the public doesn't have the competence to evaluate the incompetence of who's doing what. And then a competent person pipes up and says, that's incompetent. This is the problem with this, this, and this. But the elected official doesn't want to hear that they're incompetent because then they'd lose their job. The appointee doesn't want to hear that they're incompetent because they'll lose their job. And the public doesn't want to hear that they don't know what they're doing by voting for that elected official, because then they feel, well, I voted for that person, I'm wrong. What do I do about that? Well, I don't want to hear about any of that. So nobody wants to hear when a small, dedicated minority of people who actually know what they're doing speak up and say, we're actually spending 2 times the amount of money to make things worse in this way, this way, and this way. And this would be a better plan that would have much better outcome with less cost, right? When those groups speaks up, there's a protocol of silence, avoidance, persecution, right? A whole list of defenses to avoid that particular system, right? But, that's just the problem with a democracy, which is the majority trying to figure out something in a framework where the majority is always less informed than a distinct minority. But how do you know, if you're uninformed, who that distinct minority is, right? Because you're going to have the distinct minority that wants the job anyway, that's going to play for the job to get money, to get power, to get rank, because they want money, power, and rank. And then you're going to have the distinct minority that actually knows what they're doing. And you, the majority, you can't tell the difference. Why? Because you're not the distinct minority. In other words, one of the interesting sociological studies is that only a very distinct, competent minority can tell the difference between a distinct, competent minority and the majority. And so we, in the majority, in any given field, voting, opining about something, are wrong. The majority is always wrong. The majority has always been wrong. the majority must be wrong, because the best protocol is evolving in a bell curve pattern, right? And the next best technology, the one that's just emerging, the best way to do things today, that is currently being seed funded and nobody knows about it. It's currently in the conversation of 2 or 3 brilliant people that nobody else understands. And so it's not being adopted. It's not even fully available. You say, I want to buy one of those. Yeah, but it hasn't been approved. It's not being mass produced. But I want it. It's the best protocol. Right? It's not available to the majority. But the best approach, the best technology, the best paradigm, the best idea is always in the hands of a distinct minority. So, how about you? How have you heard the word used? Where are you able and willing to respond? Which areas, like the most useful thing to, I think, understand about responsibility is, first of all, to understand that we can respond to anything. And that we don't have time and space to respond to everything at the same time. So perhaps the most important paradigm or lens through which to view responsibility is, which of all the things I could be responding to are the most relevant to respond to? Which things, if I respond to those things, bring about the best results, right? And so, observation and statistical science can reveal, if I want to improve my health and I respond, what is the thing I could best do to improve my health? And it may be something like reducing sugar. Right? We're consuming about 100 times more sugar in the body than we were 100 years ago. So if we cut down 95% of our sugar intake, our bodies would be less prone to diabetes, etc. And so if we respond to the stuff that has the most impact, and I think deleting things is a good place to start, right? Since we have to pay for sugar and pay and go out and eat it, right? If we delete it, it doesn't take any effort. It just, I'm not doing that anymore, right? That conserves energy. If we look at our finances, what is the most important thing we can do to improve our finances? Well, it could be stop spending money on things that actually cause us hassles. So anything that is questionable, like, is it really doing anything, just cut it out. And then what's the best expense, right? Well, it could be an index fund or buying a home, right? Can look at what is the most likely thing that we could do to improve our finances. And given that we can't respond to everything all at once, what are the things that we should respond to in what order of priority in order to have the statistical likelihood of improving our lives? That question and responding to it with answers could be the single most important question that we respond to decide and prioritize our responses, and then to respond to improve the responses. So we have two things, I think. One is to prioritize responses based on data, that if I do these 5, 10, 20 things, let's say we pick the 20 things that we are most likely, if we did a good job at, to improve the quality of our lives and the lives of those around us. That's a pretty good thing. So I think I'm going to get off this video and do that, to write down what responses, if I was to do a good job of those, would have the most impact. So I'm going to do that. But then the next thing is to look at, well, what is the response? And we usually default to copying what we've seen other people do, our parents or whatever. We look at that. And we can look at the result. How much time, how much money, how much natural resources are consumed by that response? And what's the outcome? Right? If you pump someone full of steroids and do this and do that and do all these things and you can prolong their life for a month and at the cost of $100,000. Okay, well, that's this amount of natural resources, that's $100,000, it's lots of discomfort. How would another best way to save a month be? Well, if you cut down on smoking, you save money, don't consume any natural resources, doesn't take any time, and it prolongs the average life by X amount. Okay. Well, is the smoking giving enough pleasure to be worth giving up 5 years of life and $10,000 or whatever the cost is? Is that, so those are responses that are moving towards intelligence, which is the conservation of energy to produce greater yields in sustainable well-being. And so I think, and the thing that I'm going to start with today is making a list of 20 things that if I respond well to will have the most positive impact on my and the lives of people around me. Then I'm going to subset what responses seem like, what things that I'm not doing or what things that I'm doing that I could do better at to improve those results. And that last bit, is then something that I can iterate on. I can then read a book on Audible, etc., on how to do a better job in one or two of those key areas. Right? So that seems to be the most useful response to the paradigm of this word, the ability and willingness to respond, overlaid on a graph of intelligence, says that the most intelligent response, the most intelligent allocation of energy is to prioritize the responses that lead to the most amount of well-being with the least amount of effort, starting with me and rippling out. And two, to prioritize the upgrading, to find the minorities around the world that know what they're doing in that domain and try to upgrade my response to the cutting edge, which is going to be lagging because the true cutting edge is just being brainstormed, just being dreamed about, just being imagined, just being tested. But the leading edge, not the bleeding edge, that's too hard to find out, but the leading edge in each domain. Thank you for watching.